Welcome back after lunch. Our first session after lunch will be Growth Capital, the road ahead. At this time, I'd like to invite our session chair, Kasturi Ghosh, on stage, please. I'll also request the co-panelists to accompany her on stage.
Yeah, I can't even see.
So by way of introduction, Kasturi Ghosh is a partner at Trilegal's Bangalore office, and her primary practice areas are corporate, M&A, and TMT. She is advised on numerous global technology and telecommunication transactions with multinational companies. Her wealth of experience comes from advising on commercial, regulatory, entry strategies, M&As, and JVs in the TMT matters. She has acted on a wide range of telecom, IT, and financial services contracts and outsourcings. Some of the clients that she's been involved with include Telenor, Merrill Lynch, Vodafone, Philips, D.E. Shaw, Future Capital, Chrysler, etc. Sesh is the CEO of Basics Fund Services, chartered accountant by training, and is the managing director of Basics Fund Accounting. He's been in the international fund accounting and administration industry for over a decade. He started his fund accounting and administration career with Fortis Fund Service, subsidiary of Fortis Bank, headquartered in Benelux region in Netherlands, Antilles, focusing on offshore funds. Sesh has also worked with PFPC in Wilmington, Delaware, specializing in onshore fund administration for the US market. Earlier, Sesh was with Interpro Global, with interest in mutual fund industry back office processing, based out of Chennai, India. Arun Uday is the principal of Headland Capital, and he joined Headland's subsidiary, Headland Capital Partners India Private Limited, in 2007, and as a member of the venture investment team. Prior to joining Headland, he worked for Ernst & Young Corporate Finance in Mumbai as a part of the technology and media practice, Patni Computer Systems in Mumbai as a part of its M&A team, and Cognizant Technologies in Pune in the design and development of internet-related applications. He holds an MBA from the ISB, a Master's of Engineering from the Indian Institute of Sciences in Bangalore, and a Bachelor of Science from Bangalore University. Alok Mittal is the Managing Director of Canon Partners, with a broad range of hands-on experience, founding, funding, and supporting early-stage technology companies. He joined Canon India in March 2006. Alok focuses on investments in the digital media and mobile company space, as well as innovators in managed software services and other IT-enabled businesses. He regularly speaks at a number of prominent industry events, such as TIE, NASSCOM, Silicon India, Microsoft BizSpark, etc. Prior to joining the venture industry, Alok co-founded JobsHead.com, a leading web-based recruitment business, which was since acquired by Monster.com. Alok is also a co-founder of the Indian Angel Network, on the board of TIE in Delhi, and an advisor to AdTech India. During the course of his association with Canon, he has advised in their investments in Bharat Matrimony, Equitas, iYogi, Cellcast, UnitedLex, and Motor Exchange. He earned a BE in Computer Science and Engineering from IIT Delhi and an MS in Computer Science from UC Berkeley. Subhashish Majumdar is the Director of Ascent Capital and brings over 20 years of experience in the areas of fund management, consulting, and supply chains operation. He is focused on the firm's investments in activities in industries including energy, education, and financial services. He is also involved in fundraising and investor relations. Previously, in his role as a strategy consultant with PwC and IBM Business Consulting Services, he advised a large number of Indian mid-market corporates in areas such as growth and business strategy, formulation of market entry, and customer acquisition strategies. Earlier in his career, he managed a Luxembourg-based private equity fund for one of the largest insurance companies in the Middle East. He has also worked as a credit analyst at CRISIL, the Indian associate of S&P, leading a team of analysts to carry out credit rating for a portfolio of companies across a range of sectors. Subhashish is a chemical engineer from IIT Kharagpur, an MBA from IIM Bangalore, and a graduate of the AMP of the Harvard Business School. I'd now like to hand over the proceedings to the session chair.
Thank you. So we've had a star-studded cast, a blockbuster movie and lunch. So we've got a good hour ahead of us. So let's get started. What I'll do is we'll probably do the session with a five-minute sort of a report card on what the year was. And then we'll throw open the panel. We'll have some questions. And towards the end of the session, we'll throw the floor open to the audience. At the end of 2011, Asia-Pac seemed to grow at about 32%. And India was the fastest growing PE market with about a 55% sort of an increase over 2010. 531 deals were done, 40% over 2010. Exits were still tough, only 88 as opposed to 123 in the previous year. Still, the mood was fairly buoyant despite the global issues that surrounded us. Then came March, and of course, two big things happened. The good which was done by the Supreme Court in the Vodafone case was completely undone by the government by this retrospective clarification, which went back 50 years and could possibly now call into question any sale of shares which happened in an indirect manner. The second change which affected us quite greatly was the introduction of the GAAR, which basically said that even if you did a deal through a DTAA-approved route, that could still be called into question as tax avoidance. Now, over the last few months, the government has been sort of taking certain steps, going back and forth, setting up the committees to review the changes. And what we are being told is that, the promise exists of a more stable regime, of a more tax-friendly and investor-friendly regime. The government also tried to open up FDI in retail, and this time it did it in a successful manner. And albeit that it is still difficult to implement FDI in the single brand and the multi-brand space, at least it showed that the government was beginning to think of the larger pictures. The report card for 2012 was obviously, not even close to being stellar. There were only about 400 deals done, leaving aside the deals in the real estate space. Of this, 51% was in the venture space, which means the very early stage deals. Growth capital has seemed to have suffered quite a lot. Only 28 deals were done as opposed to 35. Not that that's a great measure anyway, but what is obviously worrying is the fact that it was about half in terms of value. With that, I'll move to some of the questions to the panel, and my first one is obviously the most talked of topic at this point in time, which has to do with GAAR. Now, we do know that GAAR is a reality. The committee had said, let's bring it out from 2016. The government has sort of taken a halfway stand and said that, okay, let's look at a 2015 kind of an approach. Given that, what is the mood around the GAAR? What are funds thinking? How are they trying to now look at this whole issue of GAAR? Shobha, if I can start with you.
Yeah, if you can hear us. I think for us, Ascent Capital, just to give a context, we are probably one of the few funds which had, when we raised the last fund in 2009, that point in time there was a talk about DTC coming into the play by next 2 years or whatever. So we took a call that we will go ahead with some kind of what we call unified structure. So essentially it means that our foreign LPs come into Mauritius and then we pull them in a single vehicle into India and we invest out of Indian vehicle. So in that way the fund management company is domiciled in India. We, as a fund manager, we pay taxes on our income and whatever potential carry on that. So that way, what we have ensured is that from an investor's perspective, I mean, we are of course relying on Mauritius treaty for sure, but it is much more straightforward from a tax authority's perspective because both the investment manager as well as the stream of income that is coming is being offered for tax. So to that extent, we have addressed that, but this issue has a lot of operational challenges. As probably some of my colleagues would say that the way we were earlier DVCF guidelines and we continue to remain in DVCF guidelines. that creates a lot of operational hurdles for PE managers like us in terms of not able to do sectors like NBFCs or probably no capability to do average listed deals, those kind of operational challenges. But I think from an investor perspective, it is much more straightforward because they see that this is a pool which is available for taxation at the domestic level, so they are quite comfortable. So we have in a way addressed that, but I guess the GAR and its implications in terms of the potential control over the transactions still remains for foreign funds.
Right. Alok, if we could get
So
your thoughts.
I agree with you. The GAR is a given, right? So I don't think there is an attempt to fight back on GAR. I think from our standpoint, the emphasis is much more to get clarity around what exactly will happen, what are the rules by which we should comply. To make sure that the taxation implications are understood a priori rather than after the fact. So I think that's the big part of the emphasis at this point, and hopefully the 2 years that we have between now and when GAR comes into force, allows the government to clarify that in a consultative manner. I think the second piece which is important from a GAR standpoint is that the DTA implementation has to get smoother, right? Because really, you step back, most of us are not looking at making money through tax avoidance.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Most of our LPs don't want to be in a space where they're trying to make money through that.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
Right. Now you take the US-India treaties, they're just hard to get by. Right? It's very hard to avail of the benefits of the treaty that already exists out there. So I think that's the other expectation I would have of the DTAs being implemented well over the next 2 years, 3 years time frame, so that this whole notion of tax avoidance through Mauritius is something that hopefully loses preeminence over time.
Arun, your thoughts on the matter?
Well, nothing really much to add to what our colleagues have said here, except that internally with the view we have taken is that we'll cross the bridge once we get to it, so we have not really delved too deep into it. Life goes on as of now. But on a more broader topic, I think GAR is one thing. Retrospective GAR is something obviously which caught us all unawares and had us extremely nervous. And what really worries us is really this kind of government uncertainty stemming from the government, because as business people and as investors, we are trained and we are ready to take calls on business, on financial performance, and on markets and all of this. What we are not prepared, and I don't think we would ever be prepared, is to take on call on regulation and regulatory risk and government. That's clearly not a part of the package.
Right.
When we get into an investment or when we are doing business, we go in with the assumption that the rules are defined. And then when you move the goalpost halfway through the game, then that becomes a challenge for all of us to do business. So I think clearly we have a challenge on that front, and whatever the situation be, whether it is GAR from a ongoing perspective or from a retrospective perspective or whatever that is, I think the rules of the game have to be defined so that we can factor in the risks appropriately and then price the investments accordingly and then be able to do business. I think that's clearly the viewpoint.
Sure. So a related point to that is that we're seeing a lot of cases where companies are now looking to flip up and move to a Singapore kind of a parent level structure and have a wholly owned subsidiary set up in India to which it then onshores the money. This, of course, has two issues. One is the fact that you've got to now flip up the structure, and two is when you're then selling your stake, you're possibly going to be stuck under the indirect stake sale as well. But still, this structure seems to be something which is being adopted. And Alok, you've just done a deal which has this exact flavor. What are the considerations that you went through, and would you advise the promoters in India to look at that kind of a structure?
I think it's much easier to look at these structures at the early stage of investment.
Right.
So to the extent that one of our companies has gone through this at a Series A financing stage, it's much more feasible than to do it later. I think there are a couple of considerations there. One is the business case for doing it per se, right? I think that's an important one. rest of the structuring kind of fits into those objectives rather than making that objective subservient. Clearly doing business internationally out of an India headquartered firm can have challenges, right? Investing capital, getting capital back. Singapore looks like a good jurisdiction to be able to do all that from. Second, the DTA helps. And I think Singapore has gone a little further in terms of defining what constitutes substance.
Absolutely.
Which implies a higher degree of compliance cost. But if your business purpose matches that structure, then it can be very effective. So I think those have been the couple of more important considerations. The third one that we always think about are the exit possibilities for companies. And again, because of certain restrictions on India domiciled companies, such as inability to do an initial public offering outside of India and so on.
Correct.
The exit possibilities are the other thing that we factor into those decisions.
Right. Sesh, from your side, since you're the only founder on the panel with us, and we won't give you a very hard time, but what are the kind of concerns that you would have if you were told that why don't you flip up your structure to a Singapore model?
I have a double answer to this. A, as a service provider, and B, as a founder of an enterprise that services. As a service provider, we have people who talk to us and say, we want to set up structures, Mauritius. And I'd say, don't be afraid of GAR. A, because it's a reality. B, if you have substance, if you have done it with proper good intentions, if you have at least a de minimis operations in that part of the geography where you're registered, you should generally not be troubled, because you will be able to say that you do have independent operations. They're taking the decision much as they're supported by an Indian team. So that kind of makes the taxman look a less menacing than you would normally think. So do it the right way. So the sum and substance is do it the right way. Having said that, there is a lot of uncertainty because people do not know what's going to happen. The real worry is not even the statute. The real worry is at the base level, at how the ITO, who is assessing your case, looks at you.
Right.
Remember, they have their own targets. They have their own achievements to do. And if they misinterpret and misuse, that's when you have a problem. And my hope is that with the SHOAM committee and all the GAR committees they have come up with, they are going to clearly define what constitutes a GAR transaction. From an entrepreneur perspective, no doubt, Singapore is a great place to operate from. I operate from Singapore. Right. I have a subsidiary in Singapore. Very easy to form, very easy to run. The laws are very clear. You ask a question to the government, you don't have to do an advanced tax ruling. You ask a question, it's answered. The tax notices come, they explain everything. You go to your immigration office, it's like 15-minute, 20-minute job. So it's almost works like clockwork. And believe it or not, you get refunds from the government.
Right.
I remember, I've been in Singapore since 2008. And for our Singapore employees, we contributed CPF. And the government thought that they should give all the entrepreneurs a break. They actually gave us back. Hard to see that. Right. So definitely, I sometimes think that it is better to have a holdco in Singapore and then operate. And then, of course, you have the 17% tax versus the 33 in India and right. 38 in the United States. Right. So it certainly makes a case for Singapore as headquarters. Undoubtedly, it's got a good image. People respect the image of Singapore. It's not great as Cayman or BVI. So I would think when you start your business, I would recommend that you put a holdco in Singapore first, and right. then have your entity in India. So structuring is all very important. Before you start, plan. I think half these problems will get solved. Of course, by that tone, I also mean to say that talk to people like us, which is the flip side, of course.
Sure. So the other thing that you also said was that Singapore is a great place to be because it's got a great image. It's seen to be a clean place to be at. So that sort of brings about my next question, which is on the corporate governance issues that we are seeing in India at this point in time. Is that something which, the community is looking at very closely? Because over the course of the last year, we've heard of enough deals where people have burnt their fingers. What steps do you think the community is taking at large, and perhaps you as a fund as well, to try and understand what the compliance levels are before you get in? What are the compliance levels that you want to put in after you get in?
So I think any institutional investor, when we invest in a company, obviously there is a process of due diligence which hopefully uncovers
Right.
issues that exist. Broadly, I think of these as issues which are malified in nature versus issues in education and understanding.
Right.
Right. And I think what has worried us most are the latter, because entrepreneurs genuinely believe that they are in compliance when they are not.
Right.
And that is where we have frequently sought help, not just during the pre-investment phase, but during the process of managing the investment, to make sure there is no gap between the intent and the implementation. The e-commerce issues got discussed earlier in the day, I guess, to a limited degree. And again, a lot of issues in that area are not about whether you have the right structure, but whether you have implemented it right. So, in some of our companies, we've started getting into specific audits around areas we think there might be an implementation risk on. To make sure there's no slip between the cup and the lip.
Right.
The issue of nullified promoters is a very different one.
That's difficult to spot anyway.
It's difficult to
if you're going to
spot.
run with your money
There's a process that is followed to try and spot that. If you can't, that's a big issue.
Right.
But I think to the extent that things are under our control, the latter part is where we tend to focus on and make sure that intent is translated well into implementation.
Right. Arun, your thoughts on
Well,
this?
when you talk of corporate governance, I think you need to look at it from two angles. One is the intention, and the second is ability, or willingness. If the intention is flawed from the beginning, then you have a problem, and there's nothing you can really do to fix it. If the company or if the promoter is out to defraud you, then believe me, there's nothing really you can do. First of all, it's very hard to catch him, and even if you catch him, the legal system in India is so weak that you can really walk away with the money and you can do nothing about it. So let's leave that aside for a moment. And coming to the other one, which is your ability to comply. And I think here there is a genuine challenge because this is not restricted to the PE or the subset of private companies alone. It's a systemic problem that exists across corporate India. I'll just give you a small anecdote. We have a company, we have an investee company, which is in a sector which I don't want to name, but it's in a sector which is currently in the bad books of all bankers.
Right.
By bankers, I mean the lenders, right? And the company is genuinely in need of capital because it's a capital-intensive industry. And the promoter actually, and we are not the only PE fund in the company. There are a bunch of others. And he actually came to us and said, look, I have to go now. I have to get all my banking lines renewed. And we have a Big Four auditor currently in the company, sure, as is the standard practice in all our investee companies. And he said, look, I want to take away this Big Four for now and have my audit done by a small-time accountant who will be a little more relaxed.
Correct.
And we obviously, on the face of it, it looked like a ridiculous request to be making, right? I mean, why are you even coming to us with such requests when you know it won't be met? But he had a valid point. He said, look, the biggest of the big corporates, and these are conglomerates, huge, multi-billion-dollar, the biggest corporates in India, who are in the sector, they have their books audited by, unknown auditors,
people,
and they are listed companies. And you are asking me, a small-time guy who is going through all the pains of, an industry which has been overturned for various reasons. And my banks, clearly, if I go with a Big Four audit with all the qualifications that they would have, they're not going to lend me, and I'm going to die, and look at the practical side of things. So the problem here, and the banks also, it's like, ask me no questions and I will not tell you any lies. So they know what is happening. Everyone knows what's happening, right? But it's an implicit understanding that, this is the way things work.
Remains kind of my key bet for 2013. IPO markets, we'll see. I'm sure government will raise a bunch of money, but will that be available to private companies? I don't know.
Sure, sure. So with that, we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. I think there's a mic that will go around, so feel free to put up your hand.
This is Sandeep from i3 Consulting. The question is related to the exits that we are talking about. Given the exits options are limited, so wanted to understand more in terms of why the options are limited. Is it that the follow-up buyouts are not happening, or let's say if the companies have been identified at an early stage, which is more specific to what Alok was saying, the venture-funded companies do not find a follow-up a company bigger than that, or a company which will see that future growth to take this company from the current state to the next stage. So a little understanding more in terms of why the exit options are not so much there.
Who would you like to have that question?
So maybe to the panel and then specific for the venture capitalist companies.
Sure,
let me take a starting shot at that. So I think there are two main issues in my mind. One is the presence of acquirers, right? And there are certain spaces that are handicapped just because of that. Take the internet space where we invest extensively. You just don't have large buyers available in the market, right? And this is not something that we're realizing now. This is something that we've known for years. So a lot of our investments in that area, investment thesis around that has all been contingent upon saying, we're probably not going to find a buyer for this kind of a business, right? So that is one, which is a market phenomenon. I think the second is the friction in the process. Indian companies domiciled in India do not have a flexibility of choosing their IPO market, right? That creates inefficiencies in the system. The whole regulatory hurdles around how M&A will get treated from a taxation standpoint is creating friction in the process, right? Now, all these things at the margin, take out a few buyers out of the equation, right? So I think there is a friction element of it, which certainly is something that we can do something about, and has to be the focus to make sure that companies have those exit routes available. And then there is a market element of it, which we as investors need to factor in, not at the point of exit, but the point of entry, to say what is a realistic exit route for a particular company that you're trying to get in.
Arun, do you want to answer that from a growth sort of a perspective?
See, the way the investing business works, you have fund life cycles, wherein you invest and you have a typical holding period of 5-6 years, and then you expect an exit. And what happens is you have the life cycle of this investment, and then there is the more macro business cycles that are at work, right? So, the economy or the macros go up and down or whatever. So the best thing to happen in any investment is you invest and then you ride and it matches with the upswing in the economy, and the business does well, the economy does well, everything is hunky-dory. And at the point of time of exit, you have the macros doing well, the business is done well, the capital markets are open, the IPO markets are open, then you push it into the IPO and get an exit. Now, this is really the fairy tale story that every investor is aspiring for. But unfortunately, that's not the way things happen in the real world, as we have found to our peril in the last 5-6 years, right? And what has happened here is that, a host of investments got done in the 2005 to 7 vintage, and then we had a huge down cycle. And then added to that, in our own specific case of India, then you have all the goof-ups from the government, and all of that which got discussed in the morning session. And therefore, what all of this does is that with every such shock or a blow that the company and the economy or whatever else takes, the projections that you go into at the point of investment, they start getting stretched, or the company starts slipping or whatever else. And in the worst case scenario, what you have is at the point of time when you're at the end of your holding period, you could see that the company has lagged behind by 20, 30, 40%, 50% from what you had anticipated while going in. And not only that, your capital markets are shut, your IPO markets are shut, everything is shut, so you're locked in, you don't know what to do. So therefore, what is happening is, there are two things. One is where companies have completely fallen off the cliff, there is no hope, and therefore there's no chance of an exit. So those are pretty much write-offs, right? But this moderately better situation to be in is that, okay, you have taken a hit because of all these macro factors and whatever else, but at least the fundamentals of the business are there.
Are sound.
Although the projections are, lacking or lagging behind what you had hoped for, but still there is some semblance of a good business being there. And therefore, what happens in such situations is because the capital markets are shut, but the business fundamentals are there, therefore there is another PE fund who's ready to step into shoes for making up the difference in 2-3 years, and with also the hope that it's going to open up in the 3-year holding period or 4-year holding period that he's going to hold the investment for. So that's the way it's playing out currently, and therefore you're seeing so much of activity in the secondaries market where one PE fund is selling out to another PE fund, and for all practical purposes, that's going to be a bulk of at least the growth exits that we're going to see, barring the 1 or 2 IPOs that one could be lucky to get away with.
Next question. Anybody has one?
The secondary sale, that is kind of becoming more prominent today. Are there any kind of best practices emerging, from the ones that we've seen, So also from an entrepreneur perspective in terms of transitioning to a new investor. So one of them, for example, is there a partial exit, giving more comfort to the company, less disruptive, for example? Is there anything else you've seen that you would adopt?
I think I can share from our experiences what we are trying to do in those kind of situations. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to be much more transparent to the incoming investor to start with. So if there are things which have not really gone right as against what your investment plan, and what are the key areas, I mean, let's be upfront with the incoming investor. So that way you are sharing what is the pain point, why it didn't work out, I mean, the way you were looking at it. So that gives a confidence to the incoming investors that, he's not trying to sell off something which is not true. I think that is the basic starting point. And I think if we can start there together, then of course, then the deal contour, starts making, sense. I mean, there are a lot of factors. It's not necessarily the existing investors staying back some part of it. The deal size has to be relevant for the incoming investor from their appetite perspective. So those factors then start playing in the second round. And then you try working out whether it makes sense for the incoming investor that you give him a comfort stay for another 2 years, and maybe you need to put out a little bit of more dollar at a little higher valuation. So those will start working from a second step itself.
Okay, so we'll close the panel, and I'm going to go around asking one question. What are the sectors you believe will be, of good favor in 2030?
I mean, you don't have to ask me. It's quite obvious. People are not touching investment-related demands at all. I mean, that's quite obvious. But that gives me a worry, because investment cycles have stopped probably 3 years back or maybe 4 years back, and consumption can go on, based on previous investment cycle. But some point in time, it will start showing up. So I think we are seeing early signs. HLL said lower volume growth. We saw lower same-store sales growth in, Domino's Pizzas. The other day in a call in mainland China, they're talking about very, very almost flat same-store sales growth. So slowly we are seeing the trend that discretionary expenditure being cut. So maybe, still people will go and put money in consumption sector. I think that's probably a safe bet to it. But I think the valuations will definitely contract there. That's my sense.
Fish, as the outsider.
As an outsider who gets to service
right.
All my brothers here, I can see that there's a defensive ploy. And, be cautious and invest in those themes. I wouldn't even say sectors. I think people are looking at individual companies and saying, how does this company ride the wave? And of course, there are some don't touch sectors, but there are some sectors which are touch sectors, and then you say, within those, how good are the fundamentals, and so everybody's assuming that there is going to be more times of difficulty, and then how will this company ride that time of difficulty? And I think pretty much if that is there, people, it's not that they are not, I would say it's not that they are not investing, they are investing selectively, because I'm seeing some of the funds that we service actually doing the first close, which is a healthy sign.
Sure.
So there are, so it's people are going company specific, but I see a lot of action in the food space because everybody thinks that there is going to be food shortage. So guys, be ready with your ration cards out there. Don't discard them.
So we largely focus on technology as a horizontal, and within that, I think we find the shifts in consumption to be more attractive than growth in consumption. So I think that's one theme we'll continue to explore. Services export, I think, is still an area which is fairly attractive.
Sure. Arun, what's your last thought for the day?
See, I'm going to be a contrarian and be a bit of a party pooper here and say, stick my neck out and say that I really don't subscribe to this consumption theme, at least not in the way most people talk of it. This has almost become a mantra. You speak to anyone and they say consumption, and whether he's a commoner or an investor, But if you really go back to fundamentals of economics 101 and actually see the definition of GDP, GDP is the GDP output of any country is the sum total of the consumption by the government and the public plus the investment plus net exports, which is exports minus imports. What this means is that if an economy is unduly skewed towards consumption without adequate production or production basically, then that consumption is imported from outside, right? And it's a bit like a blue collar worker who wants to wear all the fancy brands like Levi's or Nike or whatever, and wants to drive in a fancy car, but he doesn't have the income for doing that now. And therefore, what it means is if you're actually consuming at those levels, somebody is lending to you, and that implicitly again requires that at some point in time, you not only have to earn for sustaining that consumption, but also repay the loans that you have done in the past, right? So, and translating that to India, India, if you can see, it has fairly unique challenges, although the rest of the world has its own fair share of challenges. But some of the challenges that we face here in our country here are quite unique to us, which is not seen either in the developed world or even in the other BRIC economies. We have very high rates of deficit or very high levels of deficit, both physical deficit and current account deficit, and also high inflation, all of which indicate to the point that this whole growth model is under tremendous stress. This whole consumption theme is under tremendous stress. Because on the one hand, we neither have the natural resources, we are not a resource-rich country, especially in key resources like oil, where we don't have to depend on the outside world, we produce all of it inside, and therefore we are consuming what we produce inside. That's not the case. And neither is the case that we are an export-led nation like China, wherein we export and therefore earn income, and from that income we are able to consume. So where is this consumption going to come from, right? Without income at some point in time, and that's what we are seeing in the economy today. So for me, if you look at a theme which has some leg to go, I would say it is capital conservation and qualified consumption rather than just the consumption that everyone speaks of. And what this means is that consumption wherein which lend themselves to a very capital efficient model. The classic case being the telecom sector, for instance, right? The whole infrastructure, be it IT infrastructure or even the telecom towers, all of that is being hived off into a different entity, and consumption is happening on a very capital efficient basis. So such consumption themes are the ones which have some leg to go, and not the consumption, and therefore this would have very different financial characteristics from normal consumption themes, in that they would have lower margins, they would have lower returns on equity, and also a higher capital base versus the normal branded consumption themes that one would normally think or associate when he thinks of consumption. So I would say that's the theme that I would say has some leg to go for in the case of India.
In all, sort of sum and substance would be that 2013 then seems to be a fairly unstable and a sort of a yet another sort of cathartic year.
It's probably a mixed bag.
Until we actually see what the elections bring. Okay, with that, I thank my panel and hand it over to Vinny.
Thank you.
First for our panelists, please. We'll take a quick 2-minute housekeeping break. I request everybody to be seated. We are moving right on to our next.